In 1914, the Russian Empire stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean, containing over 160 million people. All political, military, and economic power rested in the hands of a single man, holding absolute authority, Tsar Nicholas II. Outside the palace walls, the reality was bleak. The vast majority of those 160 million subjects were peasants living in severe agrarian poverty. Wealth and land ownership were highly concentrated at the top, leaving the rural population tied to the dirt. Then came World War I. The conflict forced millions of poorly equipped Russian men into the trenches, draining the countryside of essential agricultural labor and rapidly bleeding the state of its resources. By 1917, the domestic economy shattered. Stripped of workers and crippled by hyperinflation, urban centers faced severe bread shortages. The supply chains broke down, and millions of civilians were starving. Centuries of strict autocratic rule had kept the population marginalized and silent. Combine that historical suppression with the sudden, agonizing shock of wartime starvation, and Russian society reached a breaking point it could no longer contain. In February of 1917, that pressure broke. Desperate bread riots in the streets of Petrograd quickly escalated, pulling in thousands of women and striking workers to demand an end to the war and the autocratic regime. The Tsar ordered the military to fire on the crowds. Instead, the soldiers mutinied. They lowered their rifles, abandoned their posts, and joined the swelling mass of civilians in the streets. Without the backing of his army, Nicholas II was forced to abdicate. In a matter of days, the 300-year-old Romanov dynasty completely dissolved. This sudden collapse created an immediate, massive power vacuum. The entire political structure of the centralized state vanished completely overnight. The removal of the Tsar left an immense void at the center of the largest country on earth. Instead of peace, the collapse opened the door for highly organized, opportunistic factions to fight for control of the ruins. A moderate provisional government stepped in to manage the state. Led by men like Alexander Kerensky, they made a highly unpopular, fatal decision. They chose to keep Russia fighting in World War I. They weren't the only ones claiming authority. Local grassroots councils made up of workers and soldiers, known as Soviets, began forming in the cities. These groups held the actual physical loyalty of the streets and the local militias. Sensing the instability, Vladimir Lenin returned from exile. He bypassed complex political theory and targeted the exact grievances of the exhausted public with 3 highly weaponized words: peace, land, bread. In October 1917, Lenin's Bolshevik faction struck. Far from a massive civilian uprising, this was a rapid, highly organized seizure of Petrograd's key communication and transport infrastructure by armed Red Guards. Marxist theory predicted a long, gradual transition from capitalism to socialism. The Bolsheviks ignored the timeline, executing a precise surgical coup to capture the state. This map illustrates the immediate result: a brutal, multi-front civil war. The Central Red Army was surrounded and squeezed by opposing forces. Boxed in, with supply and communication networks severed, the Bolsheviks had to control a massive, disconnected population without relying solely on the military. To survive, they built an immense state-sponsored propaganda machine. They needed to forge a single, unified identity and point the public toward a clear ideological enemy. They mobilized this message through an entirely new logistical network. The state deployed specialized agit trains and barges packed with constructivist art, pamphlets, and cinematic equipment to broadcast their ideology into the most isolated rural villages. The Red Army defeated the White forces on the battlefield and simultaneously secured control through intense psychological conditioning, transforming a fractured empire into a rigidly defined Soviet identity. By 1922, the Civil War ended with a decisive Red Army victory, officially establishing the Soviet Union. The high-minded Marxist promises of freedom and equality clashed immediately with reality. To secure the state, the government utilized brutal authoritarian methods, executing the Red Terror to systematically crush dissent and political opposition. Following Lenin's death, power consolidated entirely around Joseph Stalin. He aimed to rapidly industrialize the agrarian nation through strict, absolute control. The physical landscape of Russia was violently overhauled. State-owned factories and heavy collective machinery took priority over individual human life and local agriculture. The frantic pursuit of a perfect socialist utopia ultimately produced a rigid, totalitarian regime. The new government demanded the same absolute obedience as the Tsarist autocracy it had violently overthrown. While the domestic borders were sealed, the ideological impact of the revolution immediately breached them. The creation of a functioning socialist state proved it could be done. It sparked strikes, uprisings, and radical political movements across Europe and Asia, challenging capitalist governments everywhere. This diagram visualizes the resulting global split. It established the strict ideological divide that would drive the Cold War, dictating international relations, proxy conflicts, and nuclear posturing for the rest of the 20th century. But beneath that massive geopolitical shift, the day-to-day reality belonged to the Soviet citizen. They were now components in a vast, state-directed industrial machine, heavily monitored and completely subservient to the party. The events of 1917 collapsed an empire. In its place, the new state weaponized mass media, proved the terrifying efficiency of totalitarianism, and permanently split the geopolitical alignment of the modern world.